how we define a Christian nation is always bewildering to me. Christian meaning we're living according to Christ's precepts? No, and we never have been. Christian as in there are many Christians who live here? Okay, I'll grant you that. So far as whether we're founded on Christian principles, I would argue categorically we're not. There are clearly influential Christians who were involved in the founding of this country. And there were clearly Christians who were coming here for the sake of their ability to worship freely and who made attempts to function in a Christian way in this nation. Pilgrims come to mind with the Mayflower Compact and others like that. But when it got down to actually doing the nation building with the work of the founding fathers, Madison and Jefferson and Franklin, these guys were driven much more by the principles of the Enlightenment than by Christian principles. Now, the thing that gets confusing for many people, especially Christians today who want to make that argument that we are a Christian nation founded on Christian principles, is that there's a lot of overlap. Because the Enlightenment at the time of the Revolution and the founding of this country in the late 18th century, at that time, the Enlightenment was still compatible with a lot of Christian truth. There's a God, He holds us accountable, there is law, there is natural law. They agreed with all those things, and Christians agree with those things. But the idea that that makes them Christian is really wrong-headed, and that's borne out when you read Jefferson's own personal stuff, where he just rejects Christ as Redeemer and rejects the idea of the gospel, resurrection. No, that's all gone. He's basically interested in moral people who are accountable to this judge, and that's all he has.
Welcome back to We the People, citizens of two kingdoms. Have you ever heard anyone say that America is a Christian country because we have "in God we trust" on our money? A lot of people believe that. Actually, it was not until the Civil War that those words were first struck on a 2-cent coin in 1864 because of increased religious sentiment. And it wasn't until 1883 that it was on all currency. Even more, the phrase did not become the motto of the United States until an act of Congress made it the national motto in 1956. But that phrase predates the Civil War. I'm pretty sure that most of us could sing the first line of the Star-Spangled Banner from memory.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's...
It's our national anthem. During the War of 1812, as the morning light revealed that the battle-torn American flag still flew above Fort McHenry, Francis Scott Key wrote his poem, The Defense of Fort McHenry. It would later become known as the Star-Spangled Banner. In the fourth verse, which I've never heard anyone sing, it says, "Then conquer we must, when our cause it is just. And this be our motto, in God is our trust. And the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph shall wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave."
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States.
In the Pledge of Allegiance, the phrase, "one nation under God," did not become part of the pledge until 1954. After President Eisenhower heard a sermon by Reverend George Dougherty based on the Gettysburg Address. The sermon was titled, "A New Birth of Freedom." The president was sitting in the pew that Abraham Lincoln used when he attended the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. The pastor argued that the nation's might lay not in arms, but in its spirit and higher purpose. He noted that the pledge's sentiments could be those of any nation, that there was something missing in the pledge, and that which was missing was a characteristic and definitive factor in the American way of life. He cited Lincoln's words, "under God," as defining words that set the United States apart from other nations. The next day, Congressman Charles Oakman, at the urging of Eisenhower, no doubt, introduced a bill in the House to include those words, and the new pledge was adopted on June 14, 1954. Today we celebrate that day as Flag Day. Does that make America a Christian nation? Nope. In fact, in 1797, there was a treaty called the Treaty of Tripoli, It was passed by a unanimous vote. In Article 11 of that treaty was this statement:
The government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion.
So while America was not officially founded on Christianity, the use of the word God might make it a religious one. But what God do we put our trust in?
The value of having in God we trust in the money, though, I think, is the sense of accountability that builds into us as a people, that there is a God who holds us accountable. And from my perspective, when you're talking about the left-hand realm, that's sufficient. I want people to know that there's a God who's going to hold them accountable and his laws matter, and that's good. But that's not the same as the Christian God at all.
In the Declaration of Independence, it mentioned nature's God. That could include anything from a tree to a buffalo to whatever power greater than ourselves might be out there. This is called deism. Many of our nation's founders were confessed deists. Deism is the belief that the universe had a creator, but that he does not concern himself with the daily lives of humans, and he does not directly communicate with humans, either by revelation or by sacred books. They often spoke about God, nature's God, or the God of nature, but this was not the God of the Bible.
Deism, in my mind, represents that spot where a man is becoming increasingly confident and essentially living out the Genesis 3 temptation. I'm my own God. We will make it our own way. We'll pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and off we go, which sounds eerily like the American ideal. For running a country and building a nation, it's pretty good stuff. But is it Christian? Not at all. Not at all.
The use of the word God in our national motto, in the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Declaration of Independence, and wherever else it might appear, is officially called ceremonial deism. Since 1963, the Supreme Court has used a concept called ceremonial deism to decide certain cases involving the use of this word. Technically, it is related to the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. What the court has said is that if a practice is customary, even if it has religious origins, then it may be beyond the reach of the Establishment Clause. In other words, the use of the word God does not establish a religion. Through this concept of ceremonial deism, the court has ruled that its use is protected from Establishment Clause scrutiny, chiefly because they, that is the instances of the word God, have lost, through rote repetition, any significant religious content. In the first session, I asked the question, what role did Martin Luther play in the establishment of one of the most important freedoms we enjoy in America? It was the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, specifically the Establishment Clause and the Freedom Clause. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. James Madison has been called the father of the Constitution and the author of the Bill of Rights. In a letter he wrote to Reverend Schaeffer in 1821, Madison credits Luther with his doctrine of the two kingdoms for the American handling of church and state.
Reverend Sir, it illustrates the excellence of a system which, by a due distinction to which the genius and courage of Luther led the way, between what is due to Caesar and what is due to God, best promotes the discharge of both obligations.
And what was it about Luther's genius and courage? It has to do with Luther's doctrine of two kingdoms, the civil and the spiritual. Luther taught, God has ordained the two governments, the spiritual, which by the Holy Spirit under Christ makes Christians and pious people, and the secular, which restrains the unchristian and wicked, so that they are obliged to keep the peace outwardly. Therefore, where temporal power presumes to prescribe laws for the soul, it encroaches upon God's government and only misleads and destroys souls. In the 13th chapter of Romans, Paul wrote, "Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established." Whether the justices who sit on the Supreme Court realize it or not, they are there because God has established the government. Whether the senators and congressmen across the street in the Capitol building realize it or not, they are there because God has established government. Whether the President of the United States believes it or not, he is there because God established government. And why? For he is God's servant to do you good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword for nothing. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Paul also says, consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves.
Romans 13 is a demanding text and a really hard text. It's always helpful to remember that when Paul wrote the text of Romans 13, the immediate context was the Roman Empire. And we're not just talking about some of the beneficent emperors. Most likely Paul was writing this when Nero was running the show. And Nero was no friend of the Christians. Nero was not a friend of too many people. So Paul was able to say about government that it is God's government, and God uses it for his purposes, even about a corrupt emperor like Nero. So when we find ourselves in situations that are disagreeable and even wrong, we have to be very careful before we quickly rise up to say, well, this government is illegitimate, needs to be pushed out. Because you could make the case that Nero was an illegitimate ruler, but Paul wasn't ready to foment rebellion. Luther himself exemplifies this. The leaders are God's leaders. Even if they're less than desirable, even if they're not Christian, even if they're persecuting the church, they're still God's leaders. Why God allows them to exist, I don't know. And that's where we have to sometimes plead, don't understand it, but my responsibility is to speak against what is wrong, to fight against what is unjust, and yet to still be faithful to God.
Luther fully supported obeying the civil authorities. He also fully supported disobeying them when they extended their authority into the spiritual kingdom. Listen to what he said.
We are to be subject to governmental power and do what it bids, as long as it does not bind our conscience, but legislates only concerning outward matters. But if it invades the spiritual domain and constrains the conscience, over which God only must preside and rule, we should not obey it at all, but rather lose our necks.
Now, we live in a democratic republic where, for the most part, the civil kingdom has not encroached on the beliefs of the spiritual kingdom. But throughout history, there have been totalitarian governments, dictators, and persecutors of the faithful. What shall the Christian do then? Here the church, and someday that might mean you and me, must refuse obedience, even if it means martyrdom. And what does this mean?